to take up with you this morning. And well, through all of our lifetimes, the discussion of women's role in the church has been a lively discussion. The Episcopal Church began ordaining women in the 1970s, and then more recently, we have women bishops. And so the place of women has been discussed, and there's been a lot of movement in our particular denomination. But in the whole Christian church, this has been a topic for discussion. And most of the discussion gets rooted in the letters of Paul, in what Paul said about women, because Paul has some what we might call restrictive statements about women. For example, Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." So, wow, okay. So that's in First Timothy, the letter to Timothy. And then again in Corinthians, chapter 14, he writes to the Corinthian church, and he says, "Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they should be subordinate, as the law also says." So we have these restrictive statements. And there are some Christians that say, yeah, this is the Bible, the Bible says this, so we should follow these restrictive statements. There are other people who point to other statements of Paul that are non-restrictive. For example, in Galatians, Paul says, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. So there he's seeming to say, Jews and Greeks, slave people, and free men and women were all equal in this new church that Jesus has established. And we see him referring in some parts of his writing, for example, in Romans, to women that are active in ministry in this early church. So, for example, in Romans, he talks about a deacon named Phoebe. She says, "I commend to you Phoebe, a deacon of the church, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting of the saints, and help her in whatever she may require of you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well." And then in Philippians, Paul mentions two other women. He says, they seem to be fighting at the time, but he says, I urge you, Euodia, and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my loyal companion, to help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. So here Paul is mentioning co-workers in the ministry of the gospel, people that he counts on and that he works alongside of, and they're women. And so there's a kind of contradiction or a tension here. And some churches have leaned toward the restrictive statement and said this is what we can allow women to do in the church. And other churches have said, no, this is the gospel, that we are now all accepted and all valued, and we can all take part in this ministry. I don't think anybody argues that both men and women are called to ministry. The debate is more about what can women do? What kinds of ministry can they do? And that's where the tension has come. But instead of talking about Paul this morning, I want to focus on the Gospel of John to see what we can learn about Jesus and his view of women as it's expressed in that fourth gospel. And we'll see that Jesus interacts with women in a very bold way, and a way that was completely at odds with the cultural expectations of his time. And he treats women with dignity, and he engages them in ways that would have been considered inappropriate in his day. So I'd like to talk first of all about the culture in which Jesus lived and what it was like in first century Jewish culture. Of course, there's the whole layer of the Roman occupation as well. Palestine of Jesus' day is an occupied country. There are Roman forces there. So that's a whole layer too. But I'd just like to talk just about rabbinic Judaism and in the first century, the kind of religious context in which Jesus lived. So, and what I'd like to do after we establish the context in which Jesus lived, then I'd like to look at three conversations that Jesus has in the Gospel of John. First of all, in John 4 with the Samaritan woman. And then in John chapter 11, after the raising of Lazarus, he has a conversation with Lazarus' sister, Martha. So we'll look at that as a second one. And the third conversation I'd like to look at is the conversation that Jesus has, the resurrected Jesus had with Mary Magdalene outside the tomb. Okay, so those three conversations we'll look at this morning as a way of looking at how Jesus treats women in the Gospel of John and what we can learn from that. It's difficult for us in the 21st century to understand the cultural norms of 2,000 years ago. And we can read about it and understand some of it is shocking to us. How could they have ever thought that or believed that? But this is the context in which Jesus lived. And so Jesus' actions are particularly shocking, and they're recorded in John's Gospel. They would have shocked the disciples, and they would have shocked the people that were actually present with Jesus, the people who witnessed him interacting with women in these ways. They would have also shocked the readers of John's Gospel, because they're still operating under these norms too. So they read about Jesus in the Gospel of John, and they're shocked by his interactions. Why is his behavior toward women shocking? Well, here are some of the assumptions that were true about women and the way women were viewed in first century Judaism. The first thing is that women were primarily defined by their roles as bearers of children and as sexual partners for their husbands. So a woman was primarily defined in terms of physical things, her ability to bear children and her ability to be a sexual partner to her husband. The Rabbi Hia says, "It is enough for us that women rear up our children and deliver us from sin." Deliver us from sin means we can have sex with our wives. And so we're not tempted to have sex with other women. So they're convenient. They keep us from sin in order, because we can have a sexual relationship with our wife. And so that's his statement. Women, it is enough for us that women rear up our children and deliver us from sin. So there's twofold purpose of a woman. She's to bear children, and she's also to be a sexual partner for her husband. Now, not all men and not all marriages were characterized by these assumptions, but generally, the worth of women was generally defined by their biological function. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Jewish literature tends to characterize women as unclean and as sexual temptresses. So first of all, the unclean part, there were purity codes in Jesus' day, laws that determined who was clean and who was unclean, who was pure and who was impure, who was righteous and who was not righteous. And so there were various laws. You're probably familiar with many of them, such as eating laws about what you can eat, who you can eat with, what utensils you can use, what kind of foods you can ingest. These kind of laws were all through life and determined your status as a pure person or as an impure person. Women had even a harder time maintaining and keeping the status of purity than men did, because women, for example, a menstrual cycle would make you unclean. So every time you went through your menstrual cycle, you would fall from the category of pure to impure, and you would have to go through some purity rituals in the temple after your menstrual cycle to restore yourself to the status of being pure. And likewise, after childbirth, you would have to again restore your purity. So there were these purity codes in place, and the purity codes were harder on women than they were on men. Purity codes affected a lot of different things. Purity codes, your status as a righteous person or an unrighteous person was determined by your birth. Were you an Israelite or were you a Gentile? It was determined by your behavior. Did you follow the laws of purity? Did you keep the Sabbath? Did you eat according to the what? Do you wash your hands in the right way? You know, Jesus' disciples criticized for not washing their hands. It was dependent on your gender, as we just indicated. It was dependent on your physical ability. People who had handicaps or were lame or leprous or something were in the category of impure. Gentiles were in the category of impure. People could convert and become Jews, but they were still, that was a different category, a real Jew. And then another category would be somebody who had converted. So there are these purity laws in place. And generally, women have a harder time maintaining the purity status than men. It was also believed that women were sexual temptresses, that they were a temptation to men. And men were not held responsible for this. It was thought men can't help themselves. And so if they're in the presence of the woman, they will naturally be sexually attracted to her and they will be tempted to have sex with her. There's practically nothing they can do about it.
Shame on you.
Shame. So there it is. And this is one of the reasons why men and women were often kept separate. If you worship, the men worship separately from the women, and activities were done. Men gathered with men and women gathered with women. And so to remove the sexual temptation of women from men. So this is an assumption that we find shocking today. But in Jesus' day, women were barred from public life because of this. And so men made all the decisions, men conducted the public life, and women were excluded in Jesus' day. The third thing that was true about women in Jesus' day is that they were not encouraged to exercise their intellect. Men were encouraged to study the Torah, and it was a high priority to study and to learn the law and to study the scriptures. Women were not permitted to study, and they were not considered capable of study. And so they were excluded from the study of the Torah. So there's a real challenge here about the intellectual abilities of women that were restricted. So study was a high priority for men, but it was considered a sin for women to study. Rabbi Eliezer says, "It is better that the words of the law be burned than that they should be given to a woman." So that kind of strict forbidding of study. And then because a woman didn't have intellectual ability, she was also barred from being a witness. So a woman's testimony didn't count for anything. A man's testimony could be relied upon, but a woman's testimony, a woman witness had no credibility just simply because she was a woman. So these are the restrictions that Jesus is, in the culture that Jesus is living in. And we see the way that Jesus treats women and interacts with women flies in the face of many of these assumptions. And this is the pattern that we know from the Gospels, isn't it? That Jesus is constantly challenging these laws of purity, these restrictions, these laws that divide people and that create in people and out people. These are the good people and these are the bad people. And Jesus is constantly breaking through those laws by interacting with people that he's not supposed to interact with, and by engaging in being in situations and talking with people and touching people and interacting with people that he has no business, according to the law, interacting with. Jesus is a very controversial figure in his own day, and constantly was testing the law. And when we see Jesus breaking the laws, it's always for compassion. He chooses compassion over the legal following of the law. So, example, his disciples gathered grain in the grain field, and they don't wash their hands properly, and the Pharisees criticize them for not washing their hands and for harvesting grain on the Sabbath day. And Jesus says they're hungry. Come on, they're hungry. And so he is constantly opting for compassion. If people are hungry, this woman is in need, this person is sick, so I will cross these barriers, I'll break these laws because compassion requires me to. So Jesus is a figure of compassion, and he teaches us that God is a God of compassion. And he constantly pushes the limits of these laws, which is why he earns opponents, why he creates enemies for himself. So let's look at the three conversations. And I'm going to assume that you know mostly these stories, that you're pretty familiar with these stories. Jesus and his disciples pass through Samaria. Now, it's not necessary to pass through Samaria. It's the easiest route. But a lot of Jews would go around and take a longer route just to avoid Samaria. Samaria is a country on, you see the Lake Galilee and the Jordan River coming down, and the Dead Sea is to the north and the west. And so on the west side of the Jordan River would be the country of Samaria. And if he's coming down from Galilee, that would be the natural way. But if you wanted to avoid the Samaritan country and avoid Samaritans completely, which many Jews did, you would take a longer route around that area. Jesus chooses to go right through it. He stops at a well, and he sends his disciples off to get food. And there's a woman that comes to the well. You're familiar with this story. The woman comes at midday, and she comes alone, which says something about who she is. Women would usually come in the morning to draw water. And it was kind of a social event. So women would come together in a group to draw water and bring it back to the village. This woman comes in the middle of the day by herself. And so that tells us immediately she's outside of the cultural norms. She's not part of the group. And as Jesus talks with her, we understand why. She's had a series of husbands, and she's not a reputable person, as we would say. Jesus opens a conversation with this woman. Now, first of all, it's shocking that he would speak to a Samaritan, because the gospel writer explains to us the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. So it was shocking even for him to initiate a conversation with a Samaritan. It was even more shocking that he begins a conversation with a Samaritan woman, because men were not supposed to address women. You would not speak to a woman who was not a relative of yours. It was inappropriate to engage in that kind of conversation. So Jesus is bucking the norm here, engaging with the Samaritan woman. She's a Samaritan, first of all. She's a woman, second of all. And she's a person of ill repute, third of all. And so for him to open a conversation with her, a single one-on-one conversation at this well, is shocking socially and completely outside of the social norms. He opens up this conversation, asks her to give him a drink. She's drawing water, asks her. Now, Samaritans and Jews would not eat or drink together, and they certainly wouldn't share utensils. So she gives him a cup of water. He's drinking from her cup, her maybe clay jar or cup, and he's using her utensil, which is another violation of the law. We're stacking up the violations and showing just how controversial this is for him to even engage this woman. And then he has this interesting discussion with her that unfolds, where they first talk about worship. She wants to know whether worship in Jerusalem or whether worship in her area, which is right. And he kind of avoids that question. He wants to engage her to talk about her life and about saying this living water. I'd like to give you living water, and you will never thirst again. So as a result of her conversation with Jesus, this Samaritan woman believes. She comes to believe in him. Now that's also striking because this is in John chapter 4. The previous section in John chapter 3, we had Jesus having a conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus was an educated person, a ranking Pharisee. He was a person of status in the Jewish community. He comes to Jesus in the middle of the night to have a secret conversation with him, not in the broad daylight, because he's not supposed to be associating with his country. But he comes at nighttime to have a conversation with Jesus. He's an educated Jew, and yet he does not come to belief in the same way that she did. So here she comes instantly. She believes in Jesus and accepts his word instantly. And not only does she do that, but she heads back to her village to tell other people. So she is a messenger of this good news. Not only does she receive it and believe it herself, but she also becomes a messenger, a witness to her own people. She goes back and tells them, I've met a man who told me everything about myself, and you should come and meet him too. And she brings back people, and they come to believe in Jesus through her witness. So here we have an astounding story that goes completely against cultural norms. Jesus interacting with a woman that he should have nothing to do with, and inviting her to having a theological conversation with her, really, engaging her intellectually, talking to her like you can understand this, you can grasp this, I'm going to talk to you about real things that are important. This is completely outside of the cultural norms. And so for him to assume that this woman can receive this message and can understand and has the capacity to come to believe herself is an astounding thing. She becomes a witness to the Messiah. Let's look at the second story. This is a story in John chapter 11. The main part of John chapter 11 recounts the healing or the miracle of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, Jesus had these friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They live in Bethany, which is just a stone's throw from Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, there's a little hill on the east side of Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives. You can walk up it in about 10 minutes. It's a Mount of Olives. Don't think mountain, think a little hill. And on the other side of that hill, just about a mile or two away, is the little village of Bethany. So when Jesus came down to Jerusalem for festivals and things, he often stayed with this family and became very close to them, as we see by other stories in which these sisters are involved. There's a story of Mary, the sister, anointing Jesus' feet. And there's the story of Mary and Martha, who's doing the work and who's sitting at Jesus' feet. Those stories in the other Gospels. In John's Gospel, there is the story of the resurrection. And it's interesting that the resurrection story is mostly focused on Martha and Mary. Not so much on Lazarus doesn't even have a speaking part here. Martha is the key character here. And she comes to Jesus. Jesus arrives late, remember. He heard that Lazarus was sick, but he didn't leave immediately to come to Bethany. He waited a couple of days, and Lazarus died in the meantime. So he comes there, and Lazarus is already dead. He's already in the tomb. And Martha meets him and says, Lord, why didn't you come early? Now, even that question is important, because here is Martha. Women were not to be considered to have any intellect or any capacity for the faith. But here is Martha exhibiting her faith. She believes in Jesus. She believes if Jesus would have been there, her brother wouldn't have died. He could have done something. She has faith in Jesus. And she confesses this faith in him. But here again, we have an interaction which is a powerful interaction between Jesus and Martha, where they talk together about the resurrection. And Martha is predominantly arguing, yes, I know that there will be a resurrection. I know that in the life ahead. And so she's basically stating, what would have been the Pharisees' belief about the resurrection. Remember, the Pharisees believed that there was a resurrection, that people would be resurrected at the death, that life went on after death. The Sadducees didn't, and that was always a point of contention there. So she's echoing the Pharisees' teaching that there is a resurrection. She believes in the resurrection. And she acknowledges this. Jesus turns the conversation slightly and talks about himself as I am the resurrection, I am the life. And so one of these I am statements occurs here. And he's having a theological discussion with her, with a woman who's not supposed to have the capacity for this kind of a discussion. And yet he's engaging her at this level and talking to her about important things and about and she, as a result, she professes her faith and she says that he's the Messiah. Now, this is an important profession of faith because it echoes Peter's profession of faith. Remember, Peter is the one who said, "Who do you think that I am? You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God." Well, here we have a woman giving the same testimony and claiming the same thing. She has faith, she has theological understanding, and she's able to engage with theological issues, and she professes her belief in Jesus, in that he is the Messiah, and she's willing to claim that and profess it and testify to it. So here we have a woman that's outside of the bounds of what was expected of women in this day, and Jesus is engaging her fully in this way.
So question.
Yes.
Was she before or after Peter then?
Well, she's here. This is at the end of Jesus. This is probably after then what Peter's profession would have been, because this is the last miracle story in John's gospel before the passion begins. And this is the kind of climax of Jesus. John doesn't call them miracles, interestingly enough. He calls them signs. There were many, Jesus did many signs. He doesn't call them miracles. In John's gospel, there are signs, and they're signs because they point to who he is. Like a sign indicates something, it shows you something, it tells you something. These are signs that are supposed to point you towards something, help you to understand and believe. So whenever Jesus does something, multiplying the loaves or walking on water, these are signs that the disciples are meant to take in and understand and grasp that who he is and come to believe in him. So here, this is the last of those signs, and it's the greatest of those signs, raising someone from the dead. It's the culmination. And it's also the peak of the gospel, because we have in the first half of the gospel, end of chapter 1, all the way through the end of chapter 12. This is the story of Jesus' life and ministry, his teaching, the signs that he did are told. And so it kind of comes to a climax in chapter 11. And after this miracle, it says, then the Pharisees decided to kill him. This was the one that pushed them over the edge, because so many people were talking about this miracle, and it was astounding. Word getting around, he raised somebody from the dead. So this popularity, the interest in him was building, and the Pharisees determined that they had to take him out. This is where they have their discussion and say, if one man should die for the country, it's better. It's better if we just put him to death than we have a kind of movement here that threatens the Romans, and they come down and they destroy our whole religion. So instead of that, we will sacrifice one man. And John says they didn't know what they were saying, but they were predicting that Jesus would die for the people. And they didn't understand the significance of, the high priest didn't understand the significance of what he said there. So this is the final sign, and this is the sign that's the turning point where his enemies begin to plot against him. And then in chapter 13, we have the beginning of the Passion narrative, beginning with the Last Supper, and then following through the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. So this is a significant point in the gospel, and this is a very significant miracle. So here, women are not thought to be capable of studying the Torah or of understanding theological concepts. And so this conversation that Jesus has flies in the face of that. And then in addition, this profession of faith where she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. So this is an important conversation that illustrates once again that Jesus treats women in a very different way and sees them in a very different way, sees them not in the limitations of the culture, but in a much broader way. And Martha becomes an exemplary disciple, a model disciple, a disciple who shows what it means to believe and to profess that Jesus is the Messiah. So let's turn to the third conversation, and this is in John 20. So this is a resurrection story. The resurrection stories are in John chapter 20 and 21. And this is the first resurrection story, the beginning of chapter 20, where we read that Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb early on Easter morning. Now, in the other Gospels, we have a group of women that go, but here in John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene is the only one that goes. She's going by herself. And she goes early in the morning. The Gospel writer says, while it was still dark. In John's Gospel, darkness as symbolic. And so while it was still dark, she makes her way to the tomb, and she arrives there and she finds that the stone has been rolled away and the tomb is empty. Her conclusion is that someone has taken the body. Someone has stolen the body and taken it somewhere, and who knows what. But she's shocked. What she does is she runs back to the disciples, and she finds Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. There's this mysterious disciple in John's Gospel, not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, only in John. There's a disciple who's not given a name, but is simply called the disciple whom Jesus loved. Lots of scholars have been dancing around this forever, trying to figure out who this disciple is. Was he one of the 12? Was he an outsider? Who was he? And there are lots of different opinions about this. But this disciple shows up in key places in the Gospel of John. He doesn't appear in the first part where Jesus is ministering, mostly in Galilee. But he does appear at the beginning of the second part of the Gospel. So the disciple whom Jesus loved is present at the Last Supper. Remember, he's the one that's leaning against the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. And there's a conversation about who's going to betray Jesus. And Peter, who's further down the line, says, who's going to be, Jesus says, someone's going to betray me. And Peter asks the beloved disciple, ask him who it is. As the beloved disciple is right next to Jesus at the supper. But that's the first time we encounter him. We encounter him a second time at the crucifixion itself, where in John's Gospel, there are a group of women, a small group of women, 4 women, including Mary Magdalene, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and 2 others, who are at the foot of the cross, and the beloved disciple is there with them. Whoever this disciple whom Jesus loved was there at the foot of the cross with them. Now, the other Gospels have women observing the crucifixion. The male disciples are all gone. They're all hiding for fear that the Jews will come after, or the opponents of Jesus will come after them as well. So they're in hiding, but there is a group of women that observes the crucifixion in the other Gospels. But here they're right at the foot of the cross. And so it takes real courage to identify yourself as one of Jesus' disciples and to be present at the cross itself. I mean, they're surrounded by Roman soldiers. They could easily have been arrested and taken away themselves for being disciples of him. So it's courageous that they're there. First of all. And this is the scene where Jesus from the cross looks down at the beloved disciple and looks down at Mary, his mother. And he says, he gives the one to the other. And he asks this beloved disciple to take care of his mother. He's dying on the cross, and will you take care? And he gives them to one another. And from that point on, they're family. We see the beloved disciple now in this story, because Mary Magdalene, after discovering the open tomb, runs back and she finds Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loves, and she tells him what's happened. The stone has been moved away. The tomb is empty. They've taken the body. I don't know what's happened to it. It's gone. That's her message. And so the two disciples have a foot race. They run back to the tomb, and they also see that the tomb is empty. The grave clothes are folded there, and Jesus is nowhere to be found. And then it says the disciples returned home, but Mary Magdalene stays at the tomb. And an angel appears to her and says, "What are you looking for?" And she says, "Where have they laid him?" She turns around and she sees a figure that she doesn't know who it is, but she addresses him. She thinks he's the gardener. And she says, "If you know where the body is, please tell me. Where is the body that was in this grave?" And she doesn't recognize him at first. And then we have the really tender moment where Jesus says to her, "Mary," just says her name, just that one word. And instantly she knows who it is. She knows that it's Jesus. And she reaches out for him and says, "Rabboni, teacher." And she comes to life in a new way. Her mourning and her sadness fall away. There he is. And she reaches out to touch him. And here Jesus cautions her and says, your relationship with me is now different, and you can't hold on to me in the way that you did before. But he gives her a commission. He tells her to go and tell the disciples that he's risen. And so she becomes the first one to witness the resurrection. She's the first one in John's gospel to whom Jesus appears. And she's also the first one to testify to the resurrection. She's the first witness of the resurrection. So she goes back to the disciples and she says, "I've seen the Lord. He's not dead. They haven't stolen the body. He's alive. I've seen him." She's the first one to testify, which is why the church has sometimes called her the apostle to the apostles. She's the first witness to the resurrection. She's the first one that realizes Jesus is raised, and she comes with that message to the time. So she's the first one to witness to the apostles. And it's interesting. Here, Peter and the beloved disciple are at the tomb, but Jesus doesn't appear to them. They go home, and he appears to Mary Magdalene. Now, this is highly unusual again in the social context, because Mary Magdalene is not a relative of Jesus. Neither were Mary and Martha of Bethany. They were not relatives. So for Jesus to have this kind of close companionship, this close friendship with women who were not his relatives, was completely foreign in the culture and completely unacceptable. So this is astounding that his first appearance is to a woman, presumably a woman that he has healed in the past and has become a disciple of his. And she is the first one to whom he reveals himself in his risen body. And she is the first one to take this news that he's risen and to bring it back and to announce it to the disciples. Jesus says to her, "Tell my disciples," and he will meet them in Galilee. So here we see in Jesus' culture, I said, remember, a woman's witness has no credibility simply because she's a woman. A woman is not qualified to be a witness in court or to testify to anything. Her opinion or whatever she saw or witnessed to is not considered reliable because she's not capable of giving an authentic witness. And here, Jesus chooses a woman to be the first witness. So he doesn't believe this stuff. He says, "You're going to be my witness. I want you to tell the news and to bear witness to what you have seen here." So he is entrusting her with the crucial message of his gospel, that he is a risen Savior, and she is the first one to proclaim it, the apostle to the apostles. So here we see in these three conversations, first of all, we see how Jesus treats women as unique and as valuable individuals. He honors each of these women. He treats them as equals. He's not talking down to them. He's engaging them in theological discussions and teaching them and revealing himself to him, just as he would to a male disciple. Okay? So he treats women no differently. He's willing to engage with them on this level. And rather than just seeing women in their roles as wives or as mothers, or as housekeepers, as would be common in Jewish culture at that time, Jesus views them as individuals who are capable of engaging in thought, of making decisions, of being responsible, of participating in his ministry. So he calls them to be witnesses and to be, just as he calls his disciples to be witnesses. So in Jesus' interactions with women, it's entirely different. And unlike in Jesus' day, when men would have separated from women and would have avoided the contact of women, he seems to seek out women. And he has no problem at all in associating with women. And even with women like the Samaritan woman, who would have been considered impure and unclean. First of all, because she's Samaritan, and then she's not a practicing Jew, and so she's not under. So here he is associating with a woman who is unclean, which would have been forbidden to a Jewish male at that time, and especially forbidden to a Jewish rabbi. He was expected to even have a higher standard of purity than the normal males would be, because he was a rabbi. So he should be observing the law if anybody is. And he doesn't. He continually breaks the law or bends the law or stretches the law by crossing these boundaries that have been put in place. And he associates freely with women. He has friendships with women. The fact that he can speak this word tenderly married, just indicates the kind of depth of their love. And in John's gospel, this beloved disciple, the unnamed disciple, who's called the disciple whom Jesus loved, is a kind of model disciple in John's gospel. But Mary Magdalene is the female counterpart of that. So there's a male disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who has a special status in the gospel and special role to play in this gospel. But Mary Magdalene is the counterpart to that. She is also a disciple whom Jesus loves, and with which he has a very intimate and close relationship. And we see this in this encounter here, where he calls her by name, and then he commissions her to be the first witness to the gospel and sends her to the other apostles to tell them the good news. So these are powerful stories, I think, with tremendous implications, not only for Jesus' day, but for continuing for our day and for this debate about women. Jesus shows a very, very different kind of understanding of women than would have been expected in his culture. He is also willing to teach women. And so Mary sitting at his feet and receiving instruction, this just would not have been done. This is not acceptable. You could teach your male disciples, but you certainly wouldn't have a woman present. And yet he not only accepts her presence there, but he honors her. And he says, Mary's chosen the better part. He praises her for her attentiveness and her eagerness to learn from him and to listen to him. So in summary, we see this fourth gospel, this gospel of John, showing us a Jesus who has a very different understanding of women and is willing to engage women in very different ways than men in his culture were allowed to do, and especially which rabbis were allowed to do. He makes friends with them. He speaks with them. He assumes that they have intellectual ability and curiosity. He talks with them about theological ideas. He expects them to become disciples and to become witnesses and to take on the responsibility of being witnesses to the gospel. He makes them partners in his work in a way that flies in the face of the social norms of his day, which is helpful for us to think about too. We live with our own set of social norms. There are rules in society about who's in and who's out, who's good and who's good, who's acceptable and who's not acceptable, who you can associate with and who you shouldn't associate with. Those rules are still present in society. And so Jesus gives us an example of stretching beyond those rules and of flying in the face of them in order to be compassionate and to reach out to people. But I find this to be very inspiring stuff, and the model of Jesus in this gospel to be very powerful indeed in terms of a message for women and for their place in ministry in Jesus' kingdom and work.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
any
you.
questions or comments? Any questions or further comments? Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I have a question. Something I'm seeing nowadays, particularly in the Middle East and probably other places in the world, is that normally when you want to oppress somebody, you make sure that they can't read and write.
Yeah,
And it was done with slaves in this country too.
That's right.
So
that's right.
I haven't thought about it till you gave your talk, but were there a lot of rules? I mean, I know
Yeah.
not studying the Torah, so I understand
Yeah,
that's forbidden, but about women's illiteracy
Yeah,
and things like
Yeah.
that, was that
No.
something that you weren't allowed to
that's
to
right.
do? if you were a
Women
woman?
wouldn't have been educated at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, the education like that was strictly for men.
Mhm,
So most women would have been illiterate.
mhm.
I don't know if women high in society, might have been able to learn to read and write, but most women in that culture would not. And
Okay.
even Jesus' disciples probably were illiterate. So the education wasn't widespread and it
Okay.
was particular, but women especially were not educated. So in every case, when you have oppression, you have a strong majority that is making determinations for a minority.
The power structure.
So
yeah,
that's the power
dynamic-
structure.
dynamic,
So
yeah.
here we have men making decisions about women. Here's what women can do. Here's what they are. Here's what their function is. Here's what they're allowed to do. Here's what they're allowed to be. And here are the rules governing women. So it's the stronger majority defining the lives of the minority, which is what happens in situations of oppression. White people saying, this is what Black people, this is where you can live, this is what you can do, these are the jobs you can have. Men deciding for women, these are the roles you can have, this is what you may do, this is what's open to you, this is what's not open to you. And so always the majority, the powerful, dictate to the straight people saying, you can't be married like we're married because we're deciding for you what you're allowed to do, what you can't do, because we're the majority, we're the powerful majority. So every time that you have an oppressed minority, and this is the case, the powerful majority is making determinations about what is permissible for this small minority, and they're controlling them. And that's exactly what we have here. We have men controlling women in this culture and determining what they could do and what they couldn't do. What they could do is they could bear children and they could have sex with their husbands. And they could take care of a household. What they couldn't do is go to school, educate themselves, engage in public life, give witness, all of these things they couldn't do because they were women. So that's a model of oppression. Yeah. What's that?
I know we just need to finish up soon, but it also occurs to me, another way of putting this is that, and in the context of the Me Too movement and
Yeah.
the sexual assaults
Right.
and also the issues of denying abortion for
Yeah.
women, is that Jesus is also saying women are more than a sexual being
That's right.
and a child bearer.
That's right.
That they're not just that.
That's
And
exactly.
exactly
Got it
it.
exactly
But you
right.
know, when you
Yeah.
put it in the context of these things, it's like, oh, well, why aren't other men kind of getting that either?
Right. That's the challenge.
We'll have,
isn't it?
if there's
Yeah.
one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Well, just, your background on women makes me think about Mary Magdalene, all those icons of Mary Magdalene where she's holding a red egg, well, next time, if you ever see an icon of Mary Magdalene, she almost always is holding this red egg. And the story, the tradition is that she's testifying about Jesus's resurrection to the emperor.
Oh,
And the emperor said, well, I'll believe that when eggs turn red, and
Oh,
That's the story.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
you know, whether or not,
Yeah.
whether or not the first
Right.
Easter bunny is another question, but,
right, exactly.
just thinking about early in the tradition
Yeah.
that here's this woman who's chosen to testify to the emperor about
Yeah,
Jesus,
exactly,
right? I mean, that's.
Exactly, yeah, astounding. Yeah. Yeah.
Scott, any questions?
Hi, Scott.
That would be silent.
Okay,
All right. Okay,
all right.
thank you for joining us. We'll see you all in the sanctuary.
Before everybody leaves, she's requested, so some photos